So if you have a PHP project and you want to expose it using nginx in a Docker container, totally in Docker environment, so you're in the right place. That's what we're going to see in this video. If you want to learn more, stick with it. Hello, what's up guys, Medium Guy here. So right before I start this video, I want to appreciate for all the support and everything that I get from you guys, which is really motivating me to create more stuff like this. So in this video we're going to see how to run our PHP application and expose it with nginx, which will actually enable us all the features and configurations and stuff that nginx provides. So actually we'll see how to connect our application to a database and monitor the data with phpMyAdmin. That really makes everything easy with a very handy user interface. So if you want to learn about the features of nginx, I've got a whole video series about every cool feature that nginx provides in its free version. You can find the link down in the description section, and without any delay, let's get down to work. So as you can see over here, I'm in the GitHub repository for the nginx PHP FPM by user Vivao. I hope I'm spelling this correctly. And over here, we've got some description and versioning that we can use with this Docker image, which will actually use the PHP 82, which will actually provide nginx version 1.21.2. PHP version will be 8.2.9, and the base Docker image, which will be used in the image that we'll use, will be Debian Bullseye, and the composer version by which you can use to install any additional packages. Also the version will be 2.5.8. So over here you've got all the versioning which you can use based on your project depending on your use case. So over here we can see how to pull the Docker image and run it. So actually I'm going to first run it with the Docker CLI, and then we'll show you guys how to run this image with a dockercompose file, mapping your project files and nginx configuration files to inside the container so you can override the basic configurations. So I'm just gonna copy this command over here, move to the terminal, I'll hit ls to make sure I'm in the exact same place that I want to be, which is my GitHub repository on the nginx directory and the PHP directory that I've created. So basically I'll put all the files and configurations and any stuff that I create in my videos, and I'll put it to my GitHub repository, for which you can find the link down in the description section also. So I'll just paste the command that I just copied from the documentations, and if I hit enter, this will go ahead and pull the image with the tag that I just defined right over here. So because I have this image, I'll hit Ctrl+C and move to the next command over here, which is the docker run command, which will actually create a container out of this image that we just pulled. So if I hit enter, this will go ahead and create a container in detached mode and free up my terminal, so I am able to run other commands on the exact same terminal. So basically if you don't provide the -d over here, you would normally see the logs that are outputted from this container, and you won't actually be able to run any more commands on this very terminal over here. So if I hit docker ps-a, I can see a list of all the containers that are running on my laptop. So if I say docker exec -it, and I'll provide the container ID, I'll copy paste it over here, and I'll hit bash to create a bash session inside the container, and the IT switch that I provided will make the TTY execution interactive, so I'll be able to run commands inside the bash session that will be created. So I'll hit enter and I'm inside the container. So basically, as expected, if I go to /etc nginx right over here, I can find the configuration files, the nginx.conf file, and every other stuff that nginx by default will actually look in this directory and try to configure itself. Also in the documentations over here, the default webroot directory is /user share nginx html. I'll just copy this directory and move back right over here. If I cd into that directory, I'll hit ls, and you can see that I got all the files that by default is configured in this image. So just keep in mind that this is inside the container and not on my host machine. So I'll hit Ctrl D to exit the bash session, and right now I'll try to copy those directories from inside the container to my host machine, so I'll be able to change the configurations based on my use cases. So I'll say docker cp, and I'll provide the container name that I can see over here, and I'll just go ahead and pass the /etc/nginx first to right over here. I'll hit ls. You can see that nginx directory is copied from the file system of the container. So again, I'll try to do exactly the same for the /user share nginx html, and I'll just remove the /etc nginx from this, and I'll hit enter, and you can see that html directory is also copied from within inside the container. So I'll hit ls html. You can see that all the files are over here, and also for nginx you can see all the configuration files copied from inside the container. So right now I'll just go ahead and docker rm-f to force the removal of the container, and I'll pass the container name to remove that container. And if I hit ls, you can see that I've got a dockercompose file over here. So if I move to the VS Code, over here I'm in the exact same directory on my GitHub repository. You can see the dockercompose file that I've created for this video, and it has only one service, which is nginx, using the exact same image that we just pulled, and 3 volumes that are mounted to inside the container, one being the ./nginx directory that we just copied from within the container to exact same directory inside the container, and also the HTML exactly the same, and the HT password file that we'll create shortly, by which I'll use to show you guys how to change the configurations and set up our own configurations based on our use cases. So for now, I'll just comment out this line and hit save, and the ports that are mapped is port 80 to port 80 inside the container. So basically by going to localhost port 80, we'll be able to access the nginx that is running inside the container, and based on the configurations, we'll be able to access our PHP files served by the same nginx. So if I move to the terminal, I'll hit dockercompose up-d, and you can see that it creates a network and a container and attaches that container to that network. So as a result, if I go over here to localhost port 80, you can see that I get the default page, which is in PHP, that is served from the nginx. So if I go ahead and open the HTML directory, the index.php file, and actually try to make some changes over here, I'll hit save, and I get the permission error. So I move back to the terminal. I'll hit chown-r to execute the chown command recursively, and I'll pass my user ID and my group ID, and I'll pass HTML and nginx and a sudo at the beginning. So basically this will go ahead and change the owner of both these directories and all the files and directories inside them to user with the ID of 1000, which is the user that I'm currently logged in with. So if I move back to VS Code, I'll hit save, and I can see that I can save it now. So if I move back to browser and hit refresh, you can see that the changes that I made on the PHP file is detected and changed right over here. So in order to make sure we can see the information that we have, like for example the version of nginx PHP and things like that, as it is shown on the default page of this image. So right now I want to show you guys how to manipulate and change the nginx configurations. So if I move to the VS Code, I'll try to open the nginx directory and in the conf.d on the default.configuration file, you can see that we have a server block that is listening on port 80, which is exactly the port that is mapped to outside the container, and some nginx configurations. Again, if you want to learn more about nginx, you can always check my nginx video series on YouTube, which I'm sure you'll learn a lot out of it. So over here we can see we've got a location block which is listening to slash, which will actually be everything, and over here it says try files to actually serve the index.php file that we just saw, passing the query parameters that the user might pass from the URL to that PHP file. So right over here I want to add some configurations to enable the basic authentication that is integrated with nginx itself. So I'll add these 2 lines over here, which will actually look for the /ht password file to actually authenticate the basic auth requests, and then I'll just try to create the ht password file next to the dockercompose file. So I'll say ht password, and I'll pass 2 lines over here, one being user and pass and the other username and password. So if you want to deep dive in the basic authentication in nginx, you can find the relevant video on my nginx video series. So I'll hit save, and on the dockercompose file I'll try to uncomment this line, which maps the ./ht password file that we just created to /ht password inside the container, which is exactly the file that we defined in the nginx.conf file, exactly the file that we configured nginx to look for the passwords file. So I'll hit save, move to the terminal, and if I say dockercompose down and dockercompose up-d again, I actually expect my new configurations will be taken effect, and as a result, if I go to the browser, hit refresh, you can see that I am prompt with basic authentication pop-up. So if I just hit random strings, I'll hit sign in, and you can see that it is not working. So if I say user and pass, I'll hit enter, and you can see that the basic authentication is working correctly and serving PHP the same time. So lastly, I'm going to show you guys how to integrate your project, which is written in PHP and connects to a MySQL database. So I'll move to the VS Code, and the first thing that I'll try to do is to add up the database and phpMyAdmin containers to this dockercompose file over here. So on the DB service, I'm using the MySQL version 5.7 and some environment variables that just sets the default database, the root password, and a username and password that will be created initially only the first time that MySQL comes up. So a random port is mapped to the default port that MySQL will try to listen on. So basically I'll be able to connect to the MySQL that will be running as a container from my host machine on this very port over here. And on volume section, I've mapped a directory to /var lib mysql inside the container. So basically the data that will be created in MySQL will be persisted and will actually be accessible on the next uses. And over here I've got a phpMyAdmin, which is totally optional, and it is for ease of use and ease of managing of the MySQL database, because it is a web-based software with a simple user interface to manage and monitor MySQL instances. So right over here I've mapped the port 8080 to 80 inside the container, which is the port that phpMyAdmin will try to listen on. And on the environment variable section, there is a variable which is pma_host, which is set to db, which is actually the service name of the MySQL container that will be created. So basically, because all these containers will be created using the same dockercompose file, the same network will be actually shared among all these containers, and these containers actually can call each other using their service names. And as you can see, this container is depending on DB service, because actually the database should be up and running, and then this service will be available and connecting to that database. So I'll hit save, and I'll move to the HTML directory and try to remove all the contents that exists by default that we just copied from within the container. So actually this will throw an error. I'll hit cancel and move to the terminal. I'll say dockercompose down to remove the containers and free up the mapping of that directory that is mapped to inside the container. And again, go back over here, try to remove those files, and again it throws an error. And if I hit delete permanently, again I get the permission error. So basically when the container comes up, apparently it changes the permissions on some files. So I'll hit cancel and move to the terminal. I'll hit ls, I'll say sudo rm-rf html, and I'll pass a star to remove everything that exists in the HTML directory. So I'll hit ls html and the directory is cleaned up. So moving back to the VS Code over here, the HTML directory does not contain anything, and I'll just paste in some simple codes. So basically I've got a con.php, which is a PHP script that will create a connection to the MySQL database, and an index.php file, which is a simple PHP application that just manipulates some data in the database using this connection file. So basically, as we can see, I've set exactly the same credentials that I set in the dockercompose file, and over here I've just tried to create a connection to the MySQL database using these credentials. And on the index.php file, over here I've got some functions that just generate some format for the response that will be sent back to the requests, and it includes the con.php to actually be able to talk to the database. So basically right over here, it will try to select everything from the table that is named TBL and filter the ID to be 1. And actually if it can find anything, it will try to update the name column to a new value over here, and then actually will return the row that it got from this SQL command that just ran in the database. So basically the first time it will be the older value for the name column, and again if we call this, it will be set to the new value. So as a result, we'll see the connection and manipulation of our PHP application in the MySQL database. So I'll move to the terminal. I'll say dockercompose up-d to create my 3 containers and share a network among all these containers. So if I say dockercompose ps, I can see all my containers are up and running, and exactly the same ports are mapped to outside the container. And as a result, if I go to the browser on localhost 8080, I should be able to access the phpMyAdmin, and if I pass in my username and password that I defined on the dockercompose file, I'll be able to actually log in and do some stuff. So like for example, I can see the default database is created over here, and I can actually create the TBL table that the application will actually try to connect to it and manipulate some data in it. So I'll set the number of columns to 2, and actually I'll try to create the ID and name columns. The type for the name will be varchar, and the ID will be the primary with the auto increment option enabled. So I'll hit save, and my table should be created with these 2 columns. So on the insert, I'll actually be able to insert some data, and if I hit go over here, as a result 1 row is inserted, and on the browse tab I'll be able to actually see my data that are stored in the TBL table. So again, if I go back to the localhost port 80, I'll hit enter again. As you can see over here, the exact same data is retrieved from the database, and if I hit refresh, I can see that the application has changed the value to the new name, and so as a result I can see that the application has successfully connected to the database and actually can change and do stuff in the database, which is also in a container. So actually it didn't prompt me for the basic authentication password because I just passed the right password. So in order to test that it is working correctly, I'll try to run another tab on the incognito mode, and as you can see, this time I can pass the username and password. I'll hit enter, and you can see that the basic authentication, which we configured in the nginx configurations, is also working and serving our own PHP application. So that's all for this video. It got actually more than I expected, but we actually learned a lot in this video. So I hope you enjoyed this, and if you do, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button, which will really motivate me to create more free contents like this. And lastly, don't forget to watch other videos on my channel where you can find videos about other cool technologies. And if you have any questions, any recommendations, I'll be happy to see in the comment section down below. So don't forget to learn stuff each day, and with that, I hope to see you in the next video.